Development Committee meeting for Wednesday, November 9th, 2011. This is a special meeting and a regular meeting all packed into one. So if we can bring the meeting to order, we have first the special meeting. And we've got myself, Mr. Parks here, and a quorum. Mr. Labange is on jury duty and is going to try to make it over if he is able to get a break, but otherwise we will begin the meeting. Today is November 9th, 2011, and we're here in the John Farrar Council Chamber. So if we could take the first item, please.
Item number 1 is a motion, Garcetti Parks, relative to an analysis on the best way to eliminate the gross receipts tax in order to create jobs in the city of Los Angeles.
Before we hear the report and the writers of the report can come forward, I want to just say a few things at the outset to frame our discussion today. As many of you know, unemployment in Los Angeles is right now officially at about 14.8%, the highest of all major cities in the United States, and significantly higher than the national average of 9%. This unemployment rate alone is one of the reasons why we're scheduling this here, and while there are issues that are of a fiscal nature, I don't want us to lose sight of the importance, certainly that I'm sure Mr. Parks feels, that I feel, many of us, hopefully all of us know in this room when we're out there on the street talking to folks who are out of work, some of whom have been out of work now for not just months but years. I personally just want to kind of, as chair, state that I believe that economic opportunity, whether it's a good job or a business of one's own, is the foundation of a strong Los Angeles, of strong communities, of strong families, of parents who are able to provide for their children. And, you know, from a more nuts and bolts perspective, the core services that the city provides, that we protect, police and fire services, pothole repairs and schools, are more than anything else dependent on the fortunes of our economy. The revenues that we generate to support their services are generated not from within these walls, but obviously from outside them in the economy. And so it is incumbent, though, upon us as partners and as city leaders to do whatever we can to turn this economy around, to put people back to work. It's my opinion, and I think opinion of this is not something I came to ideologically, and it's certainly not something that I've come to recently, that doing that requires us to get rid of whatever job-killing taxes that we have, and in particular, that we have to do everything we can to figure out a way to eliminate the city's business tax. We can't afford to have a city's budget that is dependent on a tax that hurts job growth. And we find ourselves in that position. I think today we'll see that articulated. We have from within City Hall a belief like that we are so dependent on this, there's no way we can get off of it. But at the same time out there, there's hardly a week that goes by when I don't talk to another business that said, I'm not coming to LA, I'm not growing in LA, I want to leave LA. And it's not the only reason they cite. Certainly our inability to get things done in our city departments sometimes is cited, but it is the number one reason when I ask folks, and I ask a lot of them, it's our city's business tax. It holds businesses back, it disincentivizes businesses from coming or staying in LA, and for too long surrounding cities have used this broken tax system to lure businesses away from us. When we did our first round of major business tax reforms a few years ago, they showed some success in looking at attacking our business tax, not only from job growth and economic output, but also from a fiscal standpoint in those moves that we made. We had an across-the-board cut for all businesses. We eliminated the business tax for LA's small businesses, which create a good portion of our jobs. And then we targeted incentives based not just on the work that we saw from BTAC, but also when I chaired our Economic Development Committee, we focused with the work of our chamber and business associations, our CLA and our CAO, on the highly mobile industries and the high growth industries that were important to Los Angeles, including people who work from home, the entertainment industry, and emerging high-tech firms. And the results were overwhelmingly positive. I don't think anybody disputes that. This is one of the reasons I reconvened the Business Tax Advisory Committee, made up of LA business experts, to work on eliminating the business tax altogether. And as we all remember, in September, BTAC recommended completely eliminating the business tax over a 4-year period. So on Monday, we got the CAO and CLA report analyzing the best way to eliminate the business tax. We all know the facts. We'll hear in a second that the business tax represents $425 million important dollars in our city budget, 10% of our general fund, and we can't eliminate such a critical part of our budget without due diligence. But another thing that I created and am funding and working with the CEO for permanent source of funding is the Office of Economic Analysis, so that people's belief about things didn't get in the way of actual hard economic analysis, independent research, to assess the economic impact of legislation on the creation of jobs in Los Angeles. The city has tools to do fiscal analysis, but we didn't have in-house the tools for thorough economic analysis, which is why it was important to create that, and I think it will be a very important part of our city's governance structure moving forward and policy structure. At the September 28th Jobs Committee, I proposed that the Office of Economic Analysis analyze how best to eliminate the business tax. And after hearing these recommendations from business leaders, the business community, and city staff, I would like to right now formally request the Office of Economic Analysis to analyze two policy options. One is BTAC's 4-year phase-out plan, which includes a permanent tax holiday for new businesses. And two, the CEO's alternative recommendations, number 1 and 2, which are the extension of a tax holiday for new businesses and freezing the tax base for all existing businesses to their current gross receipts level. And I'd also like to extend, we've never really had a sunset date, but I'd like to extend BTAC's term by 6 months in order for BTAC to work with the CAO and CLA to continue to evaluate the best way to eliminate the business tax and create jobs for Angelenos. And I want to just say for my part, as chair of the committee, I want to make sure that we keep moving the ball forward on tax reform, because when we look at the amount of people that are still out of work, it is unacceptable for us to not look at one of the drivers continuing to keep business away. And if we can't do collaborative analysis, which is what the instruction was, it's going to be difficult for us to get to a point where we're doing right for our city, right for our economy, and right for our unemployed. And I would like all of us who are working on this to keep that first and foremost in our minds rather than anything else, because I think that is our job one. So with that, why don't we go ahead and ask the CAO-CLA to come forward and present the report. And do you want to say anything at the outset? Okay, and then we'll dig in. And I know we've got a lot of people here. We've got some folks who asked for some time to be able to rebut certain claims that are out there, to give their perspectives, and to be able to chime in on some of the analysis that's in the initial report here. Good morning.
Good morning, Miguel Santana, CAO. As you indicated, Mr. President, we submitted our report, and the crux of our recommendation is that should the council choose to eliminate or reduce the business tax, that concurrent to that new revenues or reductions in overall costs be identified at the same time. That the assumption that the other revenues, property tax, sales tax, hotel tax, would rise concurrent to those reductions in the context of the budget are unlikely. And so there would be a huge risk from a budgetary standpoint to make a reduction without identifying alternative revenue sources. So that basically is sort of the core thesis of our report. In the context of the report, of course, we had an opportunity to talk to a number of folks. We lay out sort of historically, to put it in context, the extent to which your council has been responsive to concerns raised in the business community by reducing or adjusting various taxes towards business to the tune of about $135 million if you were to add them all up beginning sometime in mid-1995. We list out some of the specific ones that we could identify in terms of the amount of revenue and reductions that they represented. We summarize the business tax, the BTAC committee recommendations. We engage in sort of a analysis to basically test to what extent those other revenues being recommended would have to multiply in order for them to make up the difference of the loss in revenue. And I'll have Rex walk through sort of specifically how that was established once I'm done with my introductory remarks. We looked at how other jurisdictions have managed this issue and specifically cite the state of Michigan that eliminated the gross receipts tax, but also concurrently adopted recommendations to increase revenue in other sources so that it wouldn't have a budgetary impact on them. We lay out the context of the budget, also raise the issue of Proposition 218, which is, of course, something unique to California, other jurisdictions do not face, which make it challenging for the city, should we reduce or eliminate a portion of this tax, our ability to increase it later without having to go to the voters. We, in consultation with the Finance Department, raised issues that they have shared with us. And then also in here, list out a number of alternatives that may be worth considering. We understand and hear the concern about seeking to be more responsive to the needs of the business community, and didn't want to write a report that simply stated, the impact is too enormous for you to not move forward on addressing some of those concerns, particularly in response to some of the issues raised by the Chamber and by the EDC in our conversations with them, trying to list out other options that could be considered by your council. Each one of them would have to be studied further and, consistent with your recommendation or your request that the Office of Economic Analysis do that review. But they vary from sticking to, reducing the amount by a smaller proportion that's more manageable from a budgetary standpoint. We laid out 25%, doing that over an extended period of time. That was specific to be responsive to an issue raised by some of the folks in the business community that there's a huge need for predictability. One of the concerns that we heard was that if the city were to adopt a reduction and attach it to specific triggers, or making it questionable whether it would occur on an ongoing basis, if you're a business and you're seeking either to grow your business in Los Angeles or to bring a business to Los Angeles, what is necessary is that predictability so you can map out sort of a 5-year plan as to how to proceed. So one of the alternatives looks at a way of bringing that level of predictability. The other concern that we heard was in relation to the other side of extending the tax holiday for new businesses. Of course, there are existing businesses who have been here, who've been part of the city family, and who would not receive any relief due to that. And so one of the recommendations or alternatives to look at to address that is to basically cap the business tax for all existing businesses, so that should there be any growth in those businesses wouldn't have to pay an additional tax for that growth. So it's an attempt to try to address some of the concerns about the existing businesses in light of the tax holiday for new businesses. And of course, a number of different options in terms of looking at those sectors that are the highest, have the highest percentages, to reducing that to a level that's more competitive to some of the surrounding areas, and of course several others. So each one of them, I hope you could see, was an attempt to not end the conversation simply around whether you keep the existing structure one way or the other. It was really an attempt to spark a dialogue, which is a worth dialogue having, and coming up with alternatives to move forward. With that, I'll have Rex explain specifically the analysis regarding to the multiplier effect.
My name's Rex Sala, and I'm with the CAO. What we did was just test the concept that by reducing the business tax within the budget framework, we would get like amount of money in other revenues. And it's just difficult to validate that. And the proposal would essentially roll the business back over a period of 4 years. So in this report, I just looked at, well, in 4 years, what has to happen? A value of $225 million in additional property tax was assigned. In order to get to, basically our property tax is simple. We get 1% of assessed value in the city. That's what the tax is. The city's share is 1/3 of that. So for each dollar that we receive, it would take $300 in assessed valuation. As you know, assessed valuation comes very slow because it really only changes when property changes hands. And the fact that there's intense or increased business in the city wouldn't necessarily cause that. But it would take $68 billion to make $225 million in cash receipts over 3 years. Just as a cross-check on that, in our best year in recent memory, we got $34 billion in assessed valuation.
Can I ask you something on that? When you have like 300 times, that 68 billion isn't 300 times our current valuation, is it?
What you would have to get is for each dollar that we gave up or returned to the business community, we would have to increase assessed valuation by $300. That's essentially what the connection is.
Okay, that wasn't clear. Sorry. So it's not, because it's just written, it just says 300 times after that. So
what I was attempting to do was take the dollar that whether it's $425 million or $1, if you put $1 into the business community, that would somehow have to be
you're just saying what the
leveraged
percentage is that we get of overall property valuation. It's 1/3 of 1%, thus 300 times. But it's not a 300-time increase would need to be projected in order for us to recoup that money.
No.
In other words, okay.
No,
I think that was, because some people who read it were, came to me and actually asked me that question, and I think we need to spell that out clearly. It's not an increase of 300 times the current property valuation in order for us to...
I'm specifically, and this would be the same with the sales tax,
right.
Specifically saying we don't just take $1 that we return
not dollar for dollar.
and then somehow tax that dollar back and we get it. What has to happen is it goes back into the economy, and in the case, I won't walk through the sales tax in detail, but when it goes back into the economy, our tax is 1%. So you put that dollar in, it would have to increase by 100 times to...
But in fairness, we're already comparing a bit of an ant to an elephant. If we look at if I make the entire city business tax that we collect right now versus the property valuation or the overall property taxes, they're already, just so folks put this in perspective, it already is kind of an ant compared to an elephant, correct? So it's good to make the connection that the elephant has to grow. I mean, if an elephant grows a little bit in size, that's a lot of ants. So I think that's the point you're making. But it might, as a percentage, it's not going to be a 300-size bigger elephant.
Absolutely, and that is not my intention. Yeah. And if it could take more clarity in a future report, I'll clean that up. The point is, for every dollar, whether it's $425 million or $1, property tax valuations would have to grow by... you'd have to have a 300-time increase for that dollar to generate that type of equal property tax. And that's what the intention. It'll follow with the sales tax. It's a different ratio, and it'll follow with the utility tax and the others.
Let me ask you, Rex, when you say that has to be for equal, you're talking about for the entire $400 million?
The $400 million would under this proposal be returned to the economy. We return, and that $400 million, in order to generate another $400 million, it would go to assess valuation. It wouldn't go directly to tax receipts. So it would have to be multiplied in the case of property tax by 300 times, in the case of sales tax by 100 times.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm clear that when you make that assessment, you're saying for our portion of the property tax, it would have to go up, not that the property tax is now going to be the foundation for the entire loss of business tax.
No, that was not the proposal. The proposal, it would be a substantial part, but not all of it.
Each one, yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Garcetti, essentially what Rex is saying, that assessed valuation itself, and I think these numbers match, the assessed valuation in the city would need to increase by 16% roughly.
Right, those are the relevant numbers. I think percentage comparisons are the important ones for the policy decisions here and the projections. Although it's useful to know, I mean, it was a good civics lesson for folks, or fiscal, budgeting lesson for people to understand that, for us to get a little bit of revenue, we need to see, things like valuation or property tax overall increase by larger amounts than obviously what we receive, because we only receive a portion. But I think for the policy decision, it's really looking at the percentage. If we drop the business tax, what percentage do we need to project growth in other areas for us to make that up?
And that 16% would be over and above what we would normally anticipate in any given year in order to match up with our budget outlook. So.
To put that in perspective, in our best year, our property tax grew by 34, the property tax valuations grew by 34 billion. They would have to grow by 68 billion over that 4-year period in addition to whatever we would have got otherwise. So it's a significant thing, but I agree.
So percentage-wise, what was the highest increase we ever had?
In my memory, about 11%. I got pretty good memory.
I know you do. We depend on it.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
I think that really captures what needs to be said, rather than walking through the utility tax is a 10% tax, so gross receipts would have to increase by a factor of 10. And we could walk through the hotel and others with similar things. But essentially, what the purpose of this was to step back and look at how, not impossible, but how very difficult it would be to get the kind of growth in the property tax or the sales tax that would replace the business tax. And that's really what the point here is. It's not as easy as repealing one and just expecting it to come through on another.
Anybody else? All right. Let me walk through some, and then we have some cards, but let me walk through a few things. What's an important thing for me here is there seems to be a central premise in the logic of this report, and I really want to drill down into that first. What I read here, and please tell me if it's the philosophy of the CEO or CLA, if it's otherwise, the central premise is that the only way that you can boost lost revenues is to find alternative taxes. It certainly analyzes what if things went up, but in terms of policy recommendations, looking at the Michigan one, for instance, and pointing, look, they cut here, but they made sure that they got other revenues. Tax reform maybe is another way of doing stuff, but we've done quite a bit of tax reform already. But in the presentation at the beginning, you said that. And then a second corollary to that is that I didn't philosophically get in here, and trust me, I didn't, as I've said many, many times, I didn't start this job with that. I didn't read anything in here that no cut in taxes produces business activity. So what does it, where does it go?
Well, I think the question is there's two ways of looking at it. One is from an economic standpoint, which looks at it over a period of time, and the other is from budget to budget. So the bottom line that we were trying to raise is we could, if the council were to move to reduce the business tax by 25% effective July 1st, okay, then we could very specifically identify what the loss in revenue will be, because it's a very specific targeted amount. What we can't say is what new revenue would be generated.
A fair point.
Right.
And one that I've said as well. But that's different than the tone of the report, which kind of, to me, there was also some tone in it, and then also in the presentation. And I'm not being critical. I'm just trying to figure out where we're at, because it's a very important starting principle. In presentation, in the tone of this, I mean, I'll get to the other parts of the tone in a second. The only way to protect, I'm not talking the short term, forget the timing for a moment. Philosophically, this is an act of faith or not. We either do or do not believe, and we don't need to bring that into reports necessarily, but since it's kind of been raised, that no cut in business taxes will produce additional revenue. You might say that in certain years, other revenues went up, but that was the real estate market, or this was that we don't believe, and it's a fine position to have. I mean, I think this is what we're going to need, Office of Economic Analysis. Nobody in this room with certainty can say this does happen for sure. But we either do or do not have a belief that actually can lead to, because the businesses get their businesses tax cut, right? They have more money in their pocket. What happens to that money? Is it just that the owners of those businesses go home and say, I got more money, thank God the city gave me more? Or do they spend it on hiring people? Do they, I'll say these examples so I'm blue in the face, but let me just finish real quick. In talking with people who make these business decisions, when they actually have come to Los Angeles or had cuts and then have talked about the economic activity, I can certainly look at Hollywood where we're getting the estimates, but we believe it's about 475% increased output on at least property taxes. Economic output is probably 3- or 4-fold in the last decade, just in the neighborhood of Hollywood. That's been a good thing for the entire neighborhood. Now, not 100% of those decisions, of course, were made about business tax. But what percentage of that was the ability, long before we had a tax holiday, that I could go to some large companies that located there and say, you won't be paying the business tax for the first few years. And when they orally said to me that made the difference, and we got them in because of that, there was economic output from that.
I guess the short answer to that is we don't know. We don't know exactly the correlation between the reduction in those taxes and an increase in other revenues, or an increase in, we haven't engaged in the kind of tracking. When you look at all the reductions we've done so far, we can't specifically tell you that, in 1994 and 95, when there was the wholesale manufacturing tax relief, that provided so much new revenue. And so because we cannot tell you that, because we don't know with all certainty, then it becomes a challenge then to assume that in your budget. And that's basically what the crux is. And when Rex did the analysis, trying to isolate that, it was difficult to actually draw that correlation.
The other point is that the council policy for about the last 10 years in addressing business tax reform has been to ensure that there is some type of revenue that's coming in on the other side. So for all of the changes that were done in the business tax system, there was the AB 62, was that, or the increased auditing and enforcement compliance with the business tax. So at each step, and then when the 15% cut in rates was implemented, that was based on projected growth and returning, growth beyond the projections to the tax reform. So at every step of the way, there was some recognition that the budget was going to be protected, and every effort was going to be made to pass something back to the businesses. Sure. And one of the points here is that those policies, and one of the concerns raised in this report is, there are a variety of policy decisions that the council is making on all of these, beyond just the tax rates. Mm-hmm. And the council is balancing all of those different priorities, such as restoring the funding to fire services in park and recreation and park facilities. And so in the bigger scheme, this was looking at balancing what the council has done in the past 10 years and recognizing that there are other policy decisions at play.
So having, helped author those things, I would agree. I mean, we did two things. We had increased compliance, which allowed us to cut for everybody, but we also made sure that it wasn't just that we budgeted for more, we devised things in a way in which there are triggers, so when there's growth, that some of that tax would be cut, which to me is a big contrast. Then we believe complete elimination of the business tax would be poor public policy, which makes me ask you, if we're recommending a fourth of this, if the complete elimination of the business tax would be poor public policy, and doesn't say based on any timeline, it just says period. Okay, and that's a big difference than saying if done irresponsibly, if done quickly, and not analyzing one plan that's before us, you wrote here, we believe the complete elimination of the business tax would be poor public policy, but you recommend then a quarter of it be done. Is that pretty poor public policy?
No, what we're saying is that in the context of not having a replacement revenue or an alternative tax or alternative cut, then it is poor public policy.
It didn't have those additional words in here when I read it.
Well, if you look at it in the context of the recommendation, that's basically the bottom line of the report, is that it is poor public policy to assume that if you reduce the business tax, eliminate it by any percentage or 100%, that all of these other things will happen simultaneously, budget to budget.
I don't think anybody would dispute that, but this is written quite differently, so maybe it needs a good edit on that, because, I mean, that was more kind of I don't think it's at all ambiguous. That sentence says what it says. And to me, I was disappointed in that, quite frankly. We've had a lot of conversations about this. We've talked about the right way to move forward, and let's be responsible. I don't think I or anybody else, I don't think even BTAC has said do this, just run into it and trust us. It's absolutely for sure going to work. I've said every step of the way, let's make sure we get a second set of eyes on this. Let's make sure that we have rigorous analysis. We've set up a framework to do this. But you do in certain places admit impact, and then here, and you recommend a more responsible way of doing it, and then write that it's poor public policy. I mean, I got to be honest with you guys, I haven't read a report in my 10 years that said even that phrase about anything. I mean, that was like it felt quite editorializing, not helpful to a policymaker of how we get someplace, but more like, please don't make us do this. This is terrible. It could never be done. We know better. We can't keep doing things the same way and pretend that it's going to get better. I mean, if we don't have a sense of urgency of, if somebody suggests doing it in the wrong way, find the right way. That's what I expect out of you guys, not don't do it at all. And if we don't have a sense of urgency about that out there, we won't ever have higher revenues in the city. And, if we set something up that it doesn't even have to have the exact timeline, but says based on certain growth, a piece of that growth will go to that. But it's important to me to establish that first principle. If in analyzing this, you have good reasons to believe that there is not a connection between doing this, and if you say you don't know, let's explore this together. Let's figure out a way with people who do know. This is not brand new, and I appreciate that we're trying to push to get this out this week, but has also instructed some analysis from a motion in, I think, August, the Alarcon Parks motion. So we've had a lot of time to think about it, to have more than one state that did one particular thing. I mean, let's get a bigger report, not just because it's the chair of the Jobs Committee and the president of the council asking you to do it, but because there's people out of work, because there's an urgency and a need, and I really want to underscore that. A couple other questions. When you put in here car dealerships and big box stores, which I agree. I mean, we have two different needs here. One is that on the revenue side, we have taxes that often get stolen from us, from the big box stores, from car dealerships, because and it's not just, they were clear yesterday, even Beverly Hills Porsche said it's a combination of things. I mean, it's sometimes where the land is, it's sometimes how do our departments treat people, and it's also the business tax. The ones that you pointed to from a fiscal standpoint, would you say that they are, is there anything in here that recommends from a jobs perspective what industries we should focus on? Because again, here I'll give you just the contrast to set it up. And I don't want to just lead you one road or the other, because it's not an either or. But if we focus on those, I mean, traditionally retail stores have very small multipliers. Car dealerships are not full of a ton of jobs. They're important revenues, okay? So we do need to capture the revenue piece. But if part of what we're trying to do, at least certainly on this committee and my time, and I think all of us should be, is actually bring some jobs, which makes sense. I hope we all agree on a fiscal standpoint. Jobs in Los Angeles will be good for our fiscal future. So they do, you get a twofer instead of just one. Where should we be focusing in terms of industries? We've done some before, but in the report it really focused just on sales tax revenues versus a job strategy and the places that have the highest multiplier.
The table at the back, attachment 5, does list the industries that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has identified as the areas where there's likeliest the greatest growth over the next 5 years or 10 years. well, 2008 to 2018. So that was one reference that we found. And in addition, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, the city commissioned a report by LAEDC identifying the 10 industries that
Right.
would generate likely growth in the region. And considering that the economy has changed so significantly in the last several years, it would probably be appropriate to get a revision or update to that study to identify where we see growth going.
And part of what we should analyze is not just the number of jobs projected, which is good, but also what is the multiplier effect of those. If, for instance, if we give a tax break within manufacturing, or if we give a tax break or an elimination even, in which industries will we see actually the most job growth, and what wage levels those are. Because I think the other thing is, I mean, this is the problem California faces right now, but if we're all just chasing, Costco's and car dealerships, while it's important for LA to get back on an even playing field there, we also, it's not a long-term strategy for growth either.
Yeah. Well, that's one game the city of LA has never really played, is that fiscalization of land use.
Yeah.
So.
I think we'll hear a little bit about the multiplier that was used. I believe I was told, but Mr. Swenson can refer to it more, that it was a county, not a state multiplier. A county, not a state multiplier, which would have reduced maybe some of the jobs, but not by much, by about 10%, I think, in the projection. But I'll let folks who wrote the report, and Professor Swenson, who is here, answer that. I had a couple other questions as well. I think one of the other things, to get to the first question, I think you do admit in the report, you admit some impact. There's a part where you do admit, and obviously recommendations in certain areas admit that there is some impact. And, we do this with the regular budget, and I appreciate that we do it, where we kind of say, hey, there might be $450 million deficit, which is true if we hadn't done the things we did in the past year and continued them. There's always a bigger number to kind of scare people into where we need to be. But I think, first of all, focusing in on, especially as you start to tease out some of these things, like with the car dealers, the back of napkin calculation that I did yesterday was, if we boosted just by about 10 to 15% the number of car dealers coming back into LA, we would make up, using the multiplier of how much revenue we get from our portion of the sales tax, the loss in the business tax. It's not a lot, and considering we only have, I think, 50-something, I mean, if we got 5, 6, 7 dealers back in LA, we've lost nothing, and everything above that is growth and is gravy. It's a chance for us to do better. And so part of what I really want you to do is kind of shift the culture of what we're looking at. There are smart ways of doing this that for sure are going to be better for you at budget time. But what I know it's scary, and I think part of this was kind of like, well, just don't do it. It's poor public policy. And I think that because you admit that there is impact, then we no longer are in the area of, you said you can't prove it, but we also can't disprove it either. And in fact, your report and our recent experience is predicated on that it has worked. I think if we can get away from the ideology of that it won't work, or that it will always work in any way, then we're on the same page of discussing how we get there, how we get to the elimination. If the growth of the economy means that we have growth of revenues of 10, 15%, or 4%, whatever it is, we can take those years and set it up now so that we can have fiscal security, but also really put this to work once and for all, and to see what we certainly see out there on the street with businesses, that a lot of them are making their decisions based on this. You've been there, I think, when we've heard, for instance, like Western Asset, the company that wants to come downtown. I mean, they are literally making the decision based on our policy. I think they manage, what is $600 billion of assets in Pasadena. They literally are making the decision. That's better than any study. I mean, they are telling us. Now, we don't want to set up a policy where we're just rewarding some and others get punished. We have to do it fairly. We have to, as you said, it's a great point. I mean, if we make the tax holiday permanent, what does that say to the businesses that have been here? We have to be careful about that. But at the same time, we do know that there is some connection. We can't know that it always is. We can't know that it works in any circumstance, but I hope we can kind of reset and get that, because just to be honest, the feeling I got from here was we don't know enough, and it probably doesn't, and here's a couple ways if you need to say you've done something.
Well, if I could specifically respond
Sure.
to that, I made it a point to personally meet with the EDC and the Chamber as a way of understanding this issue a little bit more from their perspective, and specifically to hear out what are some of the underlying issues, because I think the point that you're making is correct. To simply say the status quo is what it is and we should simply leave it to that should not be the end of the conversation. That there are very legitimate issues that the business community is facing, and our long-term survival as a city, both financially and economically, both for our budget and on a larger scale, is based on how well our businesses are doing. And so the list of options that are laid out were done with some thought. They were an attempt, perhaps not effectively enough for you, but an attempt to try to respond to some of the concerns we were hearing so that you could balance both the budgetary responsibilities, the fiscal responsibilities, with a level responsiveness to the concerns raised by the business community. And, it's the initiation of a conversation. It's not the end of that conversation. And so I think it would be, we will obviously explore as many options as you deem appropriate, and ultimately we'll move forward on the one that the council ends up adopting.
Thank you, and I do appreciate the alternatives you put forward. Again, maybe we can reframe them as not, it was kind of like a lot of analysis of basically don't, and we'll for sure tell you at the end don't, because it's poor public policy, eliminate the business tax. But alternative to that, you can do all these other things. I think we have to include in this analysis that one of our alternatives is how we eliminate, not to dismiss at the very beginning of the discussion because of one methodology or disagreement on something, that it can't ever be done. That is really a critical point. I think that it can be done. I wouldn't be here discussing this if it couldn't be done. And you kind of have, look, the only way you can do it is to offset, but we don't really recommend you do that, and here's the alternatives. Those alternatives are good. There's a lot of pieces of that we've been doing, and I'm proud that we have. When I look at that statistic and the amount of money we've been able to return and still do well by our budget is really important. Maybe we'd be in a worse situation without that right now. We would have fewer people even employed if we hadn't returned over, 135 million or something in business tax relief. But I think that it's important for us to do it in a way that protects our finances, but that also steadily makes that progress towards zero. Figure out a different way to get there. Yeah.
I guess one of the other policy questions in front of you, though, it's not necessarily whether it can be done or shouldn't be done, but should it be done? Mm-hmm. Because, as we note in the report, this is one of the few revenue sources that's locally controlled, locally collected. We're not subject to the state or the federal government in how we manage this tax revenue and its implementation. There are other cities, major important cities in our region that are collecting a business tax and are not eliminating their business tax. It's an important revenue source that municipal governments use and make available to themselves. So it is a policy question in front of the council, should it be eliminated? And I think that's part of what the alternatives get to, is if the question is maybe there is some value in having it available, that these alternatives such as the 25% reduction or an average tax that averages out the various taxes in the region, those kinds of things are options that are available to you.
And any thought towards like the per head tax? Or is it, again, was that a question of 218 that was raised because it would have to be designed in a new way?
If there was a complete wholesale change in the taxing system, such as a head tax, then it would require a 218 vote. If we went to a square foot tax on commercial space and industrial space, that would require going to the voters for 218. So some options are more dramatic than others in terms of the implementation. That's why I think some of the changes the council's adopted previously have been important, but not as dramatic, because they fit within the structure that we have in front of us.
Let me ask just a couple questions and make a comment, is that one of the things, and I know that we've gotten a couple of motions in talking about extending the tax holiday and a variety of things. And what I thought in reading the reports was that since 2000, we started on this journey of having tax reform. And it would appear that since 2000, when we had the, I guess, the cap at $500,000, and we had the issues of giving these tax holidays, and then we increased them in 2010, it would appear as though there is sufficient documentation to validate some of these premises as to whether we've seen businesses increase in the city. Have we seen sales tax increase in the city? Have we seen the theories that are in the Swenson report come to life? Because we've been at this for a while. We also, 2 years ago, eliminated the cap, and then we gave total tax relief for new businesses. Did that draw in the businesses that we thought it was going to do? Did the other fees and taxes get populated as the theory says? That would be a premise that I would think we would start off with, because we have real live information in our system to say, we did these things. Did it bring in 50 businesses? Did it bring in 500 businesses? Did we see the natural conclusion that all of these taxes, sales tax, property tax, did they get populated as was proposed? Do we have any information on looking at what we've done compared to the theories that's in the report?
Well, I think the CAO pointed out that we haven't done those studies yet.
Yeah.
I think, in the Swenson report, for example, it points out that by eliminating the tax on small businesses, there was a reduction in small businesses in the city.
But I think
so. We need to look. I think there needs to be a solid look at all of those questions that you've just asked. I don't think we've done it yet.
No, but see, that's what I would think. If we were looking at New York somewhere and trying to compare it to LA, would be very difficult.
Yes.
We supposedly have a good deal of information. I mean, we have a fairly good computerized system in Business Office of Finance. It tells us what happened when we eliminated businesses that paid taxes $100,000 and below, and how many registrations of businesses increase. We know from them how many businesses and how many dollars come from AB 63. We know how many dollars they've identified from their hard audits of people that never paid now are paying. And so it would appear that for us to go forward, we may not like the term business tax anymore, but something's going to have to fill that void. It's going to be something. Either we're going to acknowledge that sales tax is up and going to stay up, or those kinds of issues are going to have to come to light, because if you go forward without an assurance, then part of that program is going to have to say, you either have to identify the replacement revenues in hard numbers, or you're going to have a corresponding number of cuts and say, these are the things that are not going to be done. And that's going to be on top of what's proposed as deficits already. So I would hope that we would get the Office of Economic Development, or whatever we call it, to start looking at what we've done and say, this is what actually happened in the city of LA.
The challenge is, how do you isolate external factors like the financial crisis or an unprecedented economic boom like the one we experienced in the last decade? And
I don't think you can isolate it and make it go away, But I think what I get out of a lot of these discussions is that there's anecdotal information. We will take off on a path based on a personal conversation with a business. What the businesses I talk to, every new business doesn't mean a windfall of employment. Some of them are technology driven. We've seen the impact of putting technology just in our parking meters. We didn't add one extra person. We know that if you use technology in our parking lots, you will raise revenue significantly and maybe even reducing employment. So I think we have to, jobs are important, but I don't think every business in the city is job oriented in the sense of employment. Their revenue might increase because they've added technology as a infrastructure cost. And so I think we wouldn't be able to say what happened in Washington and the banks collapsing. We can't ignore that. But on the other hand, the fact that when we did the 15% budget or tax breaks a couple of years ago, we can't, as some people did, came forward and said every increase in business tax was a result of that reduction. That was not necessarily true, because a lot of that increase came from the auditing, came from the 4 companies we got out to hawk our dollars coming in. So a lot of things went on simultaneously that you just can't say, well, you cut it 15% and all this increase over the next 4 years came about because of that. Because there was 10 or 12 other things that were going on that was driving the revenue. So I don't think we can go forward and say everything that happened was because we cut business tax, and I don't think we could ignore what happened at the federal government and the state government, but we certainly can determine what happened here and what happened in the sense of our actions and what revenue came in, how many new businesses came in. All those things are within our grasp to deal with. Just a couple of things. One of the things I didn't understand on the premise of looking at auto businesses, the sales tax they generate, do we get all of it?
We get 1% on retail sales.
Okay, so the $600,000 or something that's mentioned in the report, we don't get that $600,000.
We would get in general, 1% of the retail sales. And so I think I made a note on that as I was.
And the same thing with the big boxes. If they're generating $700,000 in sales tax,
We only get 1%.
we get 1%. So, but on
We
the
get
other.
1% of the taxable sales, so when you go to taxable sales, multiply by 1%, and that's what it is.
Okay, is that the same as sales tax?
Our sales tax is 1% of the taxable sales, yes.
Okay, so the issue is when they list the 700,000, is that 700,000 that we get, or is that 700,000 they generate that we get 1% of?
Okay.
The report says it's the city portion.
So the 700 is the city portion.
That's correct.
Yes.
Okay, so the issue there then is what would you get?
And that would be, that would be right. 75 million would generate 700.
Okay, so that's our take.
That would be correct, yes.
Okay, and of the 75 million, what would be the business tax on that?
That would be the retail. It would depend on the business mix. It would be mostly the retail percentage, which is.
Yeah. The thing I think I'm trying to get at is that if we have big boxes and we have auto dealers and we're going to get 1% of what their sales are, and we say take the sales tax and run, what are we giving up in business tax on the basis that we're already getting the sales tax? What are we giving up, or what do we expect we're going to get in enhanced sales tax if we're giving up the business tax?
We could get back to you, I think, with a report with the help of Office of Finance of what the typical business tax on an auto dealer or
I
big
think we had the
box
stats
is.
from yesterday, though. I think it was like $3-something million right now is from all the auto folks. We won't get that back because they're already here, right? So it's how many new ones would come in to make up.
But I think what I'm trying to get at is that if you're waiving business tax and saying leave it there, and you're content with the $700,000 in sales tax you're already getting, then what?
In general, you'd be losing 1/10 of 1% of the sales.
Particular numbers.
Yeah, but I'd like to see what those numbers are.
Yes.
So that what we waived, what do we get back for waiving it if we're already getting the sales tax as it's reported?
Yes.
And then also, if I remember correctly, buying cars, even if it's in another jurisdiction, the locale where you live gets some benefit of that purchase.
Yeah, the tax is supposed to be assigned to the jurisdiction where
Purchase, so
yeah.
that you can't go to Bakersfield and buy a car and the city of LA doesn't get it. So is that the sales tax?
That is the sales tax.
Okay, so if these companies had all moved out of Los Angeles, 95 over the last whatever number of years.
20 years, yeah.
20 years. If we as citizens of LA go to their locations and buy cars, where does the sales tax go to?
Yeah.
There are allocation issues, but in general, a big item such as a car would be where the item is ultimately delivered. So if it was
So
delivered...
what do we lose with 95 companies going outside of the city?
I mean, on the sales tax?
Yeah.
And that's an allocation issue. There is loss, but it would have to be, you would have to work the problem a little bit
See, I think
more
those are the
actively.
things we need, because we have these figures that say 95 companies have left in 20 years. Bo humbug, we lost all this money. If you, as a city resident, go buy a car at one of those 95 dealers that left the city, what does the city get because they're a resident of the city? And from what I understand, the money is allocated to where you live as opposed to where you purchase. And if that's true, then we have to make some decision. Did we really lose, other than the fact that maybe their philanthropy or the property tax, or what did we lose by the movement if the sales tax is generated back to the city?
Dealers also do parts sales on site, and they do rentals on site, and they do car repair service on site.
So I think we need to break that down, because from the report, it reflects that the sales tax is a sole driver. And so again, if you're getting the sales tax regardless of the location, you might be losing the parts sales, you might be losing some other things that they are in business to do, but I don't think it's a driver in the sense of saying they left and we got nothing, particularly if you must allocate the sales tax based on the location of the person who's buying the car. So I think we need to break that down.
That's a good point.
To see,
It's not the case in big box.
well, not for big box, but it certainly is for cars.
Right.
And again, for big box, if they're outside, we're losing that sales tax. And again, whether we get any of the money from employment and people working there and bringing their money back to the city is hard to determine, but you certainly, looking at big box, it's different, but sales of cars is a unique situation that
Right.
we need to clarify what is the harm. Let me just give you about 6 or 7 things that I think we need to look at. Is that certainly, and again, no matter what we call it, Michigan looked at it and said, we can't get rid of whatever billions of dollars worth of money. We're going to call it something else, and it's going to come in another stream, but we need the money. We can't cut $1 billion out of the budget. So whatever we call it, X, in the future, we need 400 and some odd million dollars that comes into the city in some fashion. And so whether we use the Michigan study as a premise or some other study, we're going to have to find out what sources of revenue has to be generated to make it up. Because I don't think anyone has come to a conclusion we could live with $440 million less money, unless you guys have figured that out. I haven't been able to figure it out. So if we need the 440, what do we call it? And so I would think that we certainly need a list of things of what are we hear as much about entitlement processes as we do about the business tax. That's what people come to us to resolve. What are the entitlement processes? What is the delay of a year that costs the business the inability to go in business? And so, we've been fortunate that 3 years in a row we've led the city in employment. The key is that we try to make sure they're not delayed unnecessarily. We try to find places for them to have businesses that come in to the district, but our biggest effort is to reduce the delay between CRA and planning that makes their job, their business go away. So I think part of this package is going to have to be, how do we reform our entitlement process? The other issue is, what do we get the benefit of businesses with technology, that everything on businesses and jobs is technology that makes them create more revenue, which then goes into whatever we call the new revenue source, the tax X. Prop 218, we should avoid it with the plague. Because under today's light, you're not going to get people voting to tax themselves. So therefore, if you stay away from 218, I don't think you should give away money that's non-218 money before you figure out how to replace it. Because going to the ballot, you could end up harming yourself two ways. You can waste a lot of money on an election on 218 and not get the revenue, and already gave away the revenue. The other thing I think we have to, again, get back into the Office of Economic Analysis. We have to fund it, because there's many more studies that need to be done than Mr. Garcetti's funds that he voluntarily gave up. And we shouldn't be in a situation to where every time we have a study, we have to pass the hat. So we need to fund it. We need to put the studies before them. We need to get them, because every time somebody comes up with a motion, we have no idea what it costs. Adding 3 more years to the holiday, what does that cost? If we don't know, we probably shouldn't be moving forward on it. I mean, so I think we need that funded in some way so that we can get those studies done. The other thing is, what are we've had revenue days. What are the significant revenue enhancements that we must move forward on that are absent 218? We certainly just moved forward on one, dealing with the sewer charges, $2 billion worth of getting sewers done. These are things that, what can we do as a city that's going to enhance revenue absent 218? The other is, if we're going to keep going down this path, what are you going to cut in the budget? One of the things we've said now for decades, we pretty well cut 5,000 people out of the civilian workforce. 70% of the budget is still public safety. If we're going to come to grips with the budget's got to be cut, where do we cut? What clearly gets identified, not let's talk about it and move down the line and then pass it and say, Miguel, figure it out next year during the budget cycle and figure out what you cut on the fly. And then we got to figure out, what are all these enhanced, as we said in the revenue day, we need an auditor on every one of our revenue sources. How do we ensure we're getting everything we should get? How do we ensure that we're not just quibbling over what we get and as opposed to what we should be getting? And so that's a kind of a package of things I think we have to look at in order to find $400 million for Fund X. Whether, again, if we're opposed to business tax by name, somebody's going to pay $400 million in some fashion. Either it's through sales tax, business tax, documentary transfer tax, something is going to get paid, fees. It's not going to go away because I think $400 million is about the size of what we pay for a fire department. And no one has come up yet and said, cut the fire department. And so I think those are things that we have to come up with a package. And again, a lot of it has to do with a study to say, what should we be doing on these enhancements? We can't just anecdotally pick up an idea about, let's just increase this, let's cut this. What about 25% this time versus 15% last time? Let's take credit while it's increasing and saying we're responsible because of business activity. Then when it levels out, nobody says that anymore. So if we don't know on the basis of getting started about why we're doing things and what it's based on, then we're adding to the problem. And eventually, as you know, Miguel, and for the CLA, the numbers don't lie. At some point, you're either going to have enough or not enough money to pay your bills. And when you get to that point, if you haven't done all this other stuff, it's too late to say, let's just keep, generating money, or we'll create another bond, or we'll do something to get past this year. But I think we have to have a package of things. But again, I think the premise is we can get rid of business tax tomorrow. You may not like the results of it. And the key is something by another name is going to have to replace it. and maybe it's going to be funded by a variety of sources, but I just don't know at this time how you're going to even suggest $440 million be pulled out of the budget, and we will just take a flyer on it will come from somewhere. I don't want to be in that budget meeting. And so I think that's what I would recommend we look at a package of things.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parks, and just under the Brown Act, since we don't get to talk to each other directly about this stuff, I appreciate a number of your points, especially funding the Office of Economic Analysis. I appreciate your prioritizing that. I think when we look at Prop 218, just generally as we look at it, we should keep an open mind on that. I think the utility tax is a good example in recent history. If you propose something to folks in which you're trying to replace one thing with another, and there's actually a reduction in it, they won't inherently not vote for something new, because I think they get that, for instance, if we are going to put on the ballot a head tax or something, whatever it would be, but people knew that there was a reduction of an overall business gross receipts tax, I think there is an open-mindedness and a potential to win those. I think, to your point, I don't think anybody, I certainly am not, I never have, and I don't think anybody will suggest that we pull money out of a budget and not make sure that we're made whole. And when you ask where does it come from, I think how do we pay for it, rather, I think is what you said. For me, we pay for it through economic activity. You pay for it with people shopping here, you pay for it with people eating here, you pay for it with people staying here, you pay for people growing businesses here. And again, it's the devil in the details of making sure that those numbers reflect something that is reasonable, that we have the protections on the budget so that nobody can pull the money out, but that we do it in a way that protects the budget along the way. And to your point that a lot of people take credit when the businesses grow up, but then nobody speaks when it levels out. I'll continue to say the work that we did that, and I am convinced that we'd be worse off. If Nielsen didn't headquarter in Hollywood and instead went to Chicago, more people would be out of work right now in bad economic times. So it's not that it single-handedly can stop a recession, but it nevertheless makes a huge impact for the people who work there, for the restaurants that are funded and still in business because there are people in the office tower down the street. Any response or comments to Mr. Parks's issues? But we'll incorporate those in as well.
Let me you just struck a couple of those.
Sure, go ahead.
The one thing I think, and this is something that's bothered me since we've been talking about the business tax, although business people will tell you, and I think I'm fairly supportive of businesses, but I think they will tell you all the requirements and the stability they need to function. But the one thing we've never got them to do is make a commitment to stay here. And the key with that, if we see it in the movie industry, they'll go where the best deal is. And if your incentives today are number one, they may make a movie. If they are in Atlanta at the next movie, they're in Atlanta. So the commitment of businesses to be here has never been part of the equation. And so our incentives and the things that we do are fleeting. And I think that's a problem. The other thing is, I think that when we talk about some of the soft return on dollars, going to eat and go to restaurants and things like that, we also have to realize those are the very first things people stop doing when the economy's bad. And we need a sustained revenue in good times and bad times. So people maybe don't go to the cleaners as often. They don't go and eat out as often. And you talk to anyone in the restaurant business, they know clearly when there's a recession before we call it that. And so I think we have to be aware of how sustained it is. And then, even though, I have my doubts about people voting for the 218, I think we have to realize even on the utility tax, if you kind of cut into that, we realize that we offered them a 2% reduction. Mm-hmm. We didn't tell them if you didn't vote for it, you'd have no tax. Mm-hmm. And so the key is everybody wanted a 2% reduction. We just didn't quite have put a footnote on it and said, hey, don't vote for this, and there's zero. And so I think we need to be aware of just what people voted for and creating 8% versus 10%. They didn't rally around City Hall and say, I must pay 8. They were trying to get away from 10. And again, the documentation didn't tell them, don't say no, and they'd be 0. And so I think that's the thing we have to be consistent with, and looking at the dollars, they got to be hard dollars, and we have to be concerned about they kind of live throughout good times, bad times, and that we also need to figure out how do businesses make a commitment to the city if we're taking all this energy of saying we're going to buy into their theories about what it does for our economy.
And Mr. Parks, I think we do agree that, and hopefully that if there's something put on the ballot, it would be some sort of reduction. It was to the point of whether or not we could bring a new type of tax to replace that to some degree. I hope that our work here is to reduce the impact on businesses and potentially to eliminate it. But absolutely, and my point was that folks would vote for something which they know a per head tax is going to be less than what their existing gross receipts tax is. I also think that you made a good point. It's impossible to make people stay here, though. And your words were, they'll go where the incentives are number one. Our incentives, are, quite frankly, with our gross receipts tax, are nowhere close to number one right now. And so we want to get those businesses in an open marketplace that's competitive. We need to just be more competitive, and I think that's the reason that we are here. So with that, we have 5 speaker cards. So I think we'll go to. And I can folks can come to the table here, just like we do in a normal committee if they want. Lloyd Greif, Mel Cohen, Charles Swenson, Doug Arsenault, and Beverly Kenworthy. We have 5 seats if folks want to just come forward and we can go through each person.
Okay, we would like to have Professor Swenson speak before us, if that's okay.
Sure, you can go first.
Mr. Chairman.
They need to come in with something from the court to say that it's a state. That's what I don't know why they thought that was good in the first place.
Good morning, Mr. Garcetti and Mr. Parks. My name is Charles Swenson. I'm a professor at the University of Southern California, and I was the author of the study which was used to underpin the BTAC report. I'm here just to speak for just a few minutes, I think, about the report, and I think that's kind of important in light of the recent CLA report, which I just received and really haven't, because of the timing, haven't had a chance to digest, and but just want to give my initial observations with respect to that, and just very briefly. The report does use the services of an outside consultant who was rather dismissive of the work that I did, and without giving any good reasons, nor was I given any actual written comments to underlie that consultant's reasoning, or that, not consultant, whoever they used from Beacon Economics. So
I don't think they used a consultant. I think they contacted him or something like that, or maybe like that. But I don't think money. Just for the record, I want to make sure that I don't think he's been retained or paid anything. Okay.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a wrong term to use, consultant, but someone that they asked for some observations from. So just, as background on this report, before, anybody takes seriously any sort of dismissive comments, I've been in this business for 27 years. I've been publishing high-level economics research in pretty high-powered journals that are peer-reviewed, and my research has been used in Sacramento as well. So I think that the track record that I have in doing these sorts of studies is pretty reasonable. And just to speak to some things that, the research I did does a heck of a lot of things. For example, I document all the effective tax rates of cities around in California and show that, we're one of the highest rates. I also look at, I do a survey of the literature just to get some background about do city and tax incentives work, and actually perform a very careful empirical analysis to look at 2 tax rate changes in Los Angeles in the past, which use what are called, I use control groups to control for other economic factors, and I, in fact, document that those relatively modest changes do result in increased job growth as well as firms. So there's a heck of a lot of underlying material that goes into the rest of the analysis, and that rest of the analysis is to look at a number of proposals from BTAC, all of which have merit, and I was able to establish through all of this careful calibration and using a lot of economic research, the relationship, what sort of job growth we would have. And I think that job growth makes perfect economic sense, and I don't think that was ever challenged. I was also able to document, using a fairly innovative methodology, the relationship between business growth and our city's tax revenues in various components. To my knowledge, no one's ever done that before, so that was a huge part of the project as well. So the final part of it was putting all that machinery together to look at what would be the job growth and then what would be the fiscal impact. And as far as I can see, there was everything is focused on some dismissive comments about the revenue impact. If we look at the entire report, that was the one thing. Certainly it's very important, so let me speak to just that one part of it. I was very clear in the report that as you suggested, Councilman Garcetti, that when businesses locate to Los Angeles or they have more spendable income, that's going to increase the tax base in various other ways. It's just commonsensical. What I was able to do is establish empirically what an estimated magnitude of what that would be. What I was able to show is that over time, that these projected, all these different proposals would appear to pay for themselves across time. Now, it's clear that I wasn't able to, and I don't think anybody can predict with any certainty the trajectory of the indirect revenues coming in as a result of business expansion. That's subject to, again, estimation and calibration. So it's primarily, I think, the issue, at least from my mind, is one, calibration on the revenue effects in terms of, as you suggested, it probably makes sense for city officials to also take a look at this and see what they think would be the indirect revenue gains from any cuts to the business taxes and resultant business tax expansion or business and employment expansion. And then secondly, so that's calibration, and then secondly, to look at the timing. So those are really just my comments.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions? Okay. Mr. Greif?
Sure. Thank you. On behalf of BTEC, Chairman Lloyd Greif and Committee Member Mel Cohn, first, we welcome further analysis of this question by the Office of Economic Analysis. We obviously view it as being important that the city understand fully and have all of the facts in front of them and all of the analysis at their disposal in making in determining what's the right policy. I think we are also, meaning BTAC, are happy to have a dialogue and work collaboratively with Chief Administrative Officer and Chief Legislative Analyst, as well as the Office of Finance, in arriving at the best way to ultimately, in our view, eliminate the business tax. The report was interesting to read. It was interesting as much on what it said as what it did not say. What it did not say is it did not address the fact that the city of LA has, as we pointed out in our report, over the last 30 years, had a net loss of jobs despite significant residence increases. A loss of 165,000 jobs despite the fact the population grew by 823,000, which is directly contrary to what the rest of the County of Los Angeles did over the same 30-year period, which was gain 1.5 million population and gain 350,000 jobs. So the report kind of overlooks that and says, hey, and it also overlooks it from the standpoint of how disparate the business tax here is in the city of LA vis-a-vis the 87 other cities in the county. It talks about, hey, maybe you should be some equivalency with the other two highest cities, which is Beverly Hills and Santa Monica. That doesn't solve the problem. The city of LA is not competing just with the city of Beverly Hills and Santa Monica. It's competing with all the other cities in LA County, and it's competing with other metropolitan areas throughout the country. and the city of LA has by far the highest business tax, and that is the most visible aspect of the unfriendliness of the city's policy towards business. The 25% reduction that's referenced as one of the ways to go, and do that, I think, over 5 years is what the report says. Our initial reaction to that is that's not much different than the 15% reduction that occurred over 5 years. And that period of time that 15% reduction occurred is the same period of time that I just cited in the 30 years that showed a net loss in jobs in the city of LA. The city of LA has a 15% unemployment situation, materially higher, as I think you pointed out earlier today, Mr. Chairman, and an underemployment that's approaching 25%. We see the business tax as being a job killer, and how you go about phasing it out is certainly something that we think should be closely examined. But whether it should be phased out, I think the facts are already in evidence in that regard. It was interesting that yesterday the mayor announced, and I know backed by you as well as Council Member Englander, a proposal to eliminate the business tax for new car dealers. And what I say was interesting about that is that that proposal wasn't one with strings attached. It wasn't one with a sunset provision. It said eliminate it. And that really is what we're talking about here. We're talking about eliminate it. So I think that very proposal indicates that you get it and the mayor gets it, that when you approach this problem, you have to have certainty. And that certainty is if you expect Beverly Hills Porsche or any other car dealers to all of a sudden reverse course and start populating the city of Los Angeles, they're only going to do that if they know that in fact that business tax is gone and that there's not an opportunity to reverse course 2 years down the road or 3 years or 4 years down the road, and all of a sudden they're in a catch-22. And that's our concern, because in our recommendation, in addition to talking about a phase-out, which actually is 5 years because you had the announcement year and then the 4 years of the phase-out, so it really covers a 5-year period. What we refer to as year zero in our report. There was no strings attached, and we think businesses will not, and this report talks about, hey, you know, there's some issues with that. But the truth of the matter is businesses abhor uncertainty, and they will not make decisions, and they will not make investments, and they will not change their plans in terms of locating in the city or remaining in the city or expanding in the city if they think that there can be an about-face at the drop of a hat. And if you want to have a policy that's implemented here that's going to make a difference and it's going to reverse the trend from an unemployment standpoint in the city, then to generate that economic activity, it has to be with certainty in terms of that city council and the mayors and the policymakers are serious about business tax reduction. It was interesting that there was a quote in here by a gentleman at Beacon Economics, and I say it's interesting because they didn't perform any analysis, and in point of fact, they declined to do this work. That was made available to them, and they declined to do the work. So for them, subsequently, after the work is done by USC, for them to criticize it in the way they did, and again, this is. I'm presuming that this person said what he said. I find it to be rather irresponsible. If they've not been in touch with the professor, then I think they should have been in touch with the professor. And if they had questions about his work, then they should have, in point of fact, asked him those questions. We're relying on the information that's provided to us, and the city retained the professor to do this economic analysis. The city selected the professor to do this economic analysis. We welcome having other economic analysis performed. And I think BTAC will then if they need to revise the recommendation, will do so based on those facts. Do you have anything you'd like to add, Mel?
Okay.
Councilman Garcetti and Parks, we've been studying this for 10 years, and it still comes down to the issue of retaining and attracting businesses to our city. There have been tax reform measures, which I personally believe did have an impact on increasing business tax and keeping businesses. We're seeing that in the entertainment, where we had those measures passed. But in talking to my peers, the SALT tax people, when they do their due diligence, it still comes down to what I said 10 years ago. Business tax is a tiebreaker when you consider all the other factors: transportation, utilities, labor market, housing, etc. And one thing, I think we're at the point now where we can have the discussion among all of us. We now have a report. We now have a report from the CAO-CLA. We now have you looking at it. And in looking at the report, just to add one thing, to me, the Michigan alternative is not an alternative. We're not the federal government. We're not a state government where we can look to other taxes. We can't look to corporate taxes. We can't look to eliminating personal tax credits to be an offset. So I think there has to be a little reality check on our alternatives. Capping the business taxes, tax holidays are interesting suggestions. But I think one thing that was missing in the final report was that BTAC really wasn't discussed. And I think that BTAC has to be part of the discussion. And having said that, I just think we should approach this issue expeditiously. It's been 10 years. It's very important for the city to keep these businesses. The economy shifting, technology shifting, and my own personal feeling is that we really form a group, which includes BTAC, to study this, and let's move it forward to make a decision up or down, or in between. Thank you much.
And I would add in another comment. When you look at, the report talked about big box retailers, and it talked about automotive dealers, and I think you made mention of the multipliers. According to the LA EDC, the multiplier for job creation associated with a retail job is 0.4, which means in addition to the retail job itself, it only creates another 0.4. For the LA City, this is an LA City multiplier. If you look at manufacturing, it's 1.4, so 3.5 times impact for every new manufacturing job. And if you look at service, which as we know is the most mobile element, and is also the one that has the greatest ability to go, it's double what it is for retail. It's 0.8 in terms of job creation. So we think this is all about jobs, and this is all about the business taxes. Effectively is a millstone around the cities of LA. It's very visible, and it's a job killer, and it's what it's proven to be. And we're talking about how do you solve that problem? How do you solve the unemployment situation here? And we think this is one way to do it. You can talk about the new business tax holiday and extending that. We think that's meritorious. That was part of our recommendation as well. But it wasn't meant to be in a vacuum. Just like, taking a piecemeal approach to a retailer is not one industry versus another industry is, we don't think solves the problem. 25% reduction isn't going to move the needle sufficiently to solve the economic situation here. If I don't know if you saw today's Daily News, but there was an editorial in it, and I'll just quote a couple of paragraphs as soon as the siren goes by. And the editorial was dealing with the automotive dealership proposal yesterday. It says, as always, the question is why eliminate this pre-profits tax for specific industries or for new businesses, but not for all? No, the city can't just do away with the business tax all at once and swear off the approximately $440 million in revenue it brings in. But studies and city committees have concluded that done right, eliminating the tax will pay for itself in the long run, with the sales taxes and income taxes paid by newly opened businesses and newly hired employees. So where's the plan? And we think there should be a plan, and as you indicated, on how to make it happen. We think there are indirect revenues that the professor has identified that are sales tax, utility tax, property tax that will fill that void over time. And we think that needs to be thoroughly analyzed and the proper course charted.
Thank you. Douglas Arsenault.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Doug Arsenault of the Valley Industry and Commerce Association, representing more than 360 businesses in the city and region. The CAO's report calls for a historical approach. While we understand the CAO's perspective, conservative perspective, as you said, Council President Garcetti, the status quo just isn't working. Los Angeles is bleeding companies and hemorrhaging jobs. We've heard the city say time and again that job creation is the #1 priority. Yet, given this prime opportunity, the report asked the council to squander it, taking another step to push us out. The time for a change is now. If the council eliminates the business tax, maybe the city will lose a net loss. But if the gross tax remains, there's no doubt that Los Angeles will become a ghost town of vacant buildings and a government-dependent population. Both of you clearly understand this. We just urge you now to call on your colleagues to serve the needs of Angelinos out there and not just the needs of city departments. Thank you.
Thank you. Beverly Kenworthy.
Beverly Kenworthy with the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. My comments are going to be brief this morning. I'd like to state that the Chamber still does support the elimination of the gross receipts tax. We, however, also understand some of the concerns over the uncertainty related to an implementation plan, and therefore, we support a study by the Office of Economic Analysis. We look forward to working with you as well as the Business Tax Advisory Committee on seeing this issue through, and we look forward to continuing our work on this. So thank you very much for your leadership.
Thanks very much. Appreciate all your comments. So we have, I think, a motion to move forward with the Office of Economic Analysis. Analysis not just of the BTAC recommendation, but a number of the other elements outlined. And Mr. Parks' questions will, I mean, some of them were kind of more broader, but if there's anything specifically you'd like them to be looking at, make sure.
No, I would just like to ask the CAO, as part of this plan, to come back prior to next year's budget and give us a financial plan on how the Office of Economic Development will be funded, and get moving on the variety of studies that have been asked for. It is money well spent, and it's money that if it creates additional revenue that gives us a path, it's, again, money well spent. So we need that, and also to have it included in next year's budget. And then the list of questions, I would like to see a package approach of what are the things that we should be thinking about as we create the Fund X that we, for creating $400 million worth of revenue in the city, as opposed to relying on business tax solely.
And if I could direct the Office of Economic Analysis to work with the Office of Finance, with BTAC, and Professor Swenson, just at least to make sure that they're in the conversation as well, and whoever's going to be doing that work to not just read the report, but hear from individuals who are working on this and who have worked on the report as well. Okay. Thank you. All right, let's go to item number 2 in the special meeting.
Item number 2 is a city attorney report and ordinance relative to adding paragraph X to section 21.49C3 of chapter 2 of article 1 of the Los Angeles Municipal Code regarding the business tax exemption of certain mutual funds.
Okay. I think we have, this is a relatively straightforward one. I would move to adopt the ordinance. Obviously, the mutual fund industry, we have a double taxation on, and it's one that has high-paying jobs, makes Los Angeles more competitive in the future. But tell us what we have before us, briefly.
Basically, as the honorable body has requested, this is
ordinance. And we just say your name for the record for those listening on telephone.
Sorry about that. Good morning, Pejman Shamtub, Deputy City Attorney. Basically, we drafted as directed an ordinance to exempt certain mutual funds based very closely on the federal exemption for certain income that's distributed to shareholders. This was intended to be drafted rather narrowly to include only mutual funds of the type that the CLA report included, and has been forwarded to the CAO and the Office of Finance for their consideration as well.
What and the reduction of the fiscal impact on this? I know Mr. Wickham reports that $8.4 million is what we're looking at.
John Wickham, CLA, I believe it was $4 to $6 million, somewhere in there, and that was on the business tax piece alone, but we were still retaining the business tax on the management services that are provided to the mutual fund. So that was...
I'm looking at a report from... I don't have a date on it. But
I don't have the report in front of me that I...
So the elimination of the tax on this class of businesses would have an impact on the general fund of $8.4 million based on 2008 receipts.
Yeah.
Maybe our receipts are down... for mutual funds, as we've all experienced since 2008. So do you think it might be a little bit lower? Or do we, in this past year?
It might be, but I don't know that we've got the most recent data on that. And actually, we have to be fairly careful with that. Somebody's giving me my report. That's very generous of them. Appreciate that.
They're coming from every direction. I got a copy for you, too.
Okay, great. Yeah, so between 2008, 2010, mutual fund entities had a total tax of $8.4 million, 7.2, and 6.8 million reflect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe a little bit lower, but yeah, because that was the downturn, I assume.
Exactly, that's the economic downturn.
So it may have, to your point, and on, the cars and other things, that was like a $3 million impact. There's no proposal to replace this revenue in the budget, correct?
No, council did not approve that in the policy that they moved forward in this case.
Okay. You have any questions on this, Mr. Max? You okay moving forward?
Yeah.
The ordinance? Okay. All right, we'll move the ordinance forward. And thank you to Council District 9, too, for your leadership on it. Appreciate it. Let's go ahead and do the regular meeting. We have a quorum for that as well, Mr. Parks and myself, and take up item number 1.
Item number 1 is a motion, Englander, Garcetti, Labange, relative to the request for the city attorney to prepare and present an ordinance to extend the business tax holiday for new businesses for an additional 3 years.
And the fact that if we've had all this stuff been going since 2000, why don't we have some analysis?
Hello again.
Hi, John Wickham, CLA. This is a motion that would simply extend the business tax holiday for an additional 3 years. It's simply changing the date of the sunset out. So there are no other changes to the existing policy. The businesses would still receive the benefit for a 3-year period, according to the instruction in this motion. The instruction, if approved, would simply request that the city attorney prepare the ordinance and return that ordinance to your committee and the council for consideration.
So does the grandfathered in businesses, do they get an additional 3 years, or we're just saying for the next 3 years, a new business?
Any new business that would come in would get the 3 years, but the existing that are here, they only get 3 years. The policy on 3 years
I think
doesn't
a lot of people
change.
wondered if that meant that people suddenly had 6 years, but just want to be
Yeah.
clear about that.
But anybody who comes in the third year will receive 3 years.
Right. Exactly. Okay. And the mayor obviously has put forward his support of making this permanent. One of the things that I'd like to move this forward for now. One of the things I'd like to fold into our analysis, if I can direct the CLA and CAO to work together on this, is what some of the policy issues are for if we were to make to extend from 3 years the term to a permanent term, what that does overall for our revenues and potential competitiveness, because it, while it certainly further and come closer to and something I support in terms of getting rid of the overall gross receipts tax, I think the legitimate issues that folks have raised in terms of, those companies that have been here forever saying, wait a second, you're helping out the new guy and not me. So
We would want to confer with city attorney on that point to make sure that it doesn't create an unfair business advantage for businesses. The 3-year period there's some justification for that, making that permanent actually puts existing businesses at a disadvantage.
Sure. Okay, let's fold the city attorney into that analysis then.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Sparks?
Let me just ask on this particular item that we asked CAO and the Office of Finance and the CLA that as that ordinance comes forward, I would certainly like to see, since we have been in this mode of these incentives, 3-year tax holiday, whether we can get some idea of how many new businesses have been attracted to the city, how many have taken advantage of this incentive, what is the amount of business taxes we would have received and been waived, how much have we determined of other types of taxations or fees have been generated because these businesses are now in the city. And I do think the issue of the permanent area of waiving or having a business tax has to be studied by the economic development area so that we clearly know what that means, and again, whether it's legally feasible.
Yeah, it's my understanding, both from Office of Finance and from Dr. Swenson, who looked at this, that the data the programs hasn't been in place long enough to do a full analysis of the first year and a half, but we're coming up on that period, so we should be able to have some data for you in the next couple of months.
Let me just throw one other thing in there. I would think if we started, I think in 2000, with a cap of 500,000 on businesses, and we basically gave a tax holiday, but they capped it, that would add something to give us an idea that we attract businesses. Then in 2010, when we went to a full, without a cap, and we gave it a tax holiday for 3 years. So I don't think we should look at it as exclusive of each other, that we incrementally moved from a 500 cap to a 0 cap, and we moved, from 2 years to 3 years. So we should have a lot of documentation in that arena as we're thinking about the thought of saying, making it a permanent waiver, or we're thinking about adding 3 more years.
So you're saying a more in-depth analysis of all of the new business exemptions from the beginning through now?
Well, I think we need that, but I think what we need to zero in on is we did have a period of time before 2010 where we had a cap of $500,000 with a waiver. What did we see in that period? Then what did we see when we eliminated the cap? And then I think the larger issue is what have we seen from the benefit of reform in general.
Absolutely.
But those specific ones that deal with, I think if we're going to validate the theory of Dr. Swinson, we need to look at the information that is current, because we can't ignore the period of time that we had the tax holiday but a cap of $500,000.
Yeah.
That should be foremost. What occurred with that? And then what occurred when we expanded it for the last 2 years? I don't want to look at the last 2 years in isolation, but I think in giving us some view of the 500,000 cap, certainly gives us many more years to evaluate.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and move the motion.
With the amendment.
With the amendments. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. All right. There's no public comment on this, so there's no general public comment either. So this meeting is adjourned. Thank you. You can do the rest of your day.